All right. Well, let's talk about how we can study autobiographical memory. When I was in grad school, one of my colleagues, one of my classmates was studying autobiographical memory. And one of the things he was talking about is the difficulty of determining whether the memory that the person is retrieving is, in fact, a real memory, right? Because with the other kinds of memory that we've talked about so far, we can do like teach you a list of words and then see if you can recall it or not, right? Like that's we know what the material was because we taught it to you for the purposes of the experiment, and then we're just seeing whether you encoded it fully or you can retrieve it adequately, things like that. With autobiographical memory, you have to actually establish whether the memory is real or not. And, if we can't necessarily trust the participant to produce a real memory, we can't necessarily check with their parents and be any more confident that it's something that happened, right? So it's really a tricky subject to study. So psychological researchers are clever though. So don't be afraid. They have come up with ways to study it. So, targeted event recall is when you ask the subject to recall a specific documented event from their past. So, what we're going to do in this technique is to analyze the style of recall. Are they going to move forward where they begin at the event and then the story ends in the present? Or are they going to do what is called the backward style of recall, which is where they basically are just retrieving isolated details without necessarily like a chronological aspect to it? One of the things that the targeted event recall technique does is it allows us to assess how far away the event seems to the subject. So, I think we can agree probably that my ant bite story seems close, right? It doesn't seem that far away when I tell the story. You're, in the end, surprised that it was 35 years ago. It seems like yesterday that you got bit by ants. So you can assess how far away the event seems based on how the person tells the story and how they include details. It gives us insight into whether what they're telling us is a memory versus what they're telling us is a fact. So the key thing in this one is they have to recall a specific documented event from their past. So sometimes this would be retelling, high school graduation, or telling us about a time that they were in the hospital, and we know that they were in the hospital because they gave us access to their medical records, or something that could be objectively documented so that, the researcher knows for sure that the event happened. Now, what the researcher doesn't necessarily know is the details of the event, but they know that the person had been in the hospital. It's the person's job to talk about, whether they want to or not, why they were in the hospital, how long, these kinds of details. That's what's going to be sort of measured in that style of recall, right? They get to choose what details they want to talk about. And what the researcher's interested in isn't necessarily the content, but the style, right? Did they do a backward or a forward delivery of the information? Diaries would be another way to go about it. So you ask the participant, did you keep a diary as a young person? And then can we look at it? And then you ask the subject questions that are related to the contents of the diary. So it allows a much broader range of memories than the targeted event recall does, because the targeted event recall, it has to be something that is objectively documentable. Like we know that it happened because we have a graduation record, or we have a hospital record, or we have an arrest record, or we have something that lets us know that the event happened. But think about it, there are only certain events in life that are documented like that, right? And so the kinds of things that a person chooses to write down in their diary might be much broader. It might talk about, a job interview that they went on, or a date that they went on, or an argument that they got in with someone. I mean, it could be a whole bunch of different kinds of things that are in diaries. So, of course, you're really dependent on the participant being willing to let you read their diary, which is kind of a tricky thing right there. But and then you can do that forward and backward analysis of their recall styles. Keywords would be where you use keywords as prompts to get people to retrieve things from their autobiographical memory. And from these kinds of cue words, we have discovered that there's like this autobiographical memory function. Now, some of the cue words that you provide are not going to necessarily trigger a memory for the individual. But when it does, we can kind of get a picture of how, on average, people, not this individual, but how, on average, how people tend to recall autobiographical memories. So let me tell you about a study by Usher and Neisser from 1993. Here's the graph that they produced. And here are the cue words: sibling birth, a death, being admitted to the hospital, moving your household, right? Your household moved. And we have these events happening when the person is age 1, age 2, 3, 4, or 5. And then how many memories were recalled? Did the person recall these things having happened in their lifetime, and, you know, the details that they recalled? And so what you'll find is that basically no one at age 1, if there was a death that occurred when the person was age 1, nobody remembers that. Going to the hospital when they were age 1, no one remembers that. Moving when they were age 1, no one remembers that. The one thing that some people remember, if they were age 1 when it happened, is the birth of a sibling. So you see that in the blue line. We're about 0.2% recalled a sibling birth. See, it's kind of, I can't remember I don't independently recall. I read the study and now I'm trying to remember, because see how the Y axis is labeled 0.2, and then the label says memories recalled percent. So is that 0.2% or is that 20%? I think it's 20%. So about 20% of people who had a sibling born when the participant was a year old, about 20% of them recall the birth of their sibling. By the age of 3, you're up to about 40% of them recalling the birth of a sibling. And that kind of flattens out. Like, that's about the best you get all the way up to age 5. Age 5 looks like it dips off a little bit, but it's not significantly different. So birth of a sibling is a pretty important event if you're a tiny infant, 1 or 2 years old. By the age of 3, it's at the maximum and kind of tapers off. Being admitted to the hospital, if you're 2 or if you're 4, you see those peaks. It turns out that's not significantly different from age 3 and 5 either. So going to the hospital, if you're 2 or above, you're likely to recall it. You're more likely to recall it. If you have the family moves, that's the dashed with dots in it between it line. You see that if the family moved, you're much more likely to remember that if you're 4 or 5 when that happens than if you're 2 or 3, right? And same thing with a death. You really are not aware of it or don't really remember it until you're about 5, and then you're likely to remember it. Just as an aside on the death issue, one of the problems with that is that you may remember that there was a death or whatever, but maybe didn't really process what that meant until you were older. On average, 5-year-olds have no idea that it's permanent and stuff like that. So that might help to explain why younger kids don't remember it. They maybe had no idea what any of this meant that was going on. Whereas being in the hospital, that's going to be a lot more meaningful to the individual. Having a sibling born, that's going to be a lot more meaningful to the individual. And so they tend to remember it better. But these are what we call autobiographical function. A function is the term that is used to describe how the data moves in like these lines. So you're seeing these different functions for different kinds of memories, different cues. All right. Now I put this little overlap at the bottom. Family stories and pictures can really have an impact on the recollection of these different events. And so, seeing a picture of yourself holding your baby sibling can really fuel the belief that you remember your baby sibling coming home. My brother was 2.5 when I was born, and my parents distinctly remember coming home from the hospital with me and Jeff running out to see them, and they remember it. But my brother never said that he remembered the day I came home. Like, he doesn't remember that at all. So different people have different memories, but my parents would tell the story And, Jeff had one of those experiences where he's like, I don't remember that, but I've heard this story so often. I'm starting to think, do I remember that? But he's like, I don't independently remember it. So family stories and pictures really contribute to those, to the recall. Now, things that tend to happen to us when we're 1, 2, 3, those are really likely to just become facts, where you start to lose the context, you start to lose, the emotionality and all that stuff, and it just becomes part of your family story. My sibling was born when I was 1.5 years, right? You don't really have that specific emotion tied to it or the context, and you don't remember those details. If you're 4 or 5 years old when the event happened, the memories are stronger. There tends to be more detail included with it, more likely to report things like I was scared or I was excited or those kinds of emotional aspects. So from 4 on, we start to see autobiographical memories having more content to them. Sometimes people will tell me that when they don't know exactly how old they were in this memory, but they'll have this sort of vague, I had one student tell me, I think I was laying in my crib, but I don't really know for sure. And I just know that there was like dappled sun coming in the window and that I was just feeling completely at peace. Like everything was, I just felt completely cared for and fine and just laying in my crib watching the window. And the person has no clue how old they were, but they're thinking they were in a crib. So they're thinking they must have been, under whatever age they were when they moved to a bed, right? A lot of times our first ever memories are those kind of really amorphous, they're sort of shapeless. You're not sure what you're remembering. It's just sort of like, a lot of times it has to do with light and shadow, or it might have to do with your colors. One of my earliest memories just involves bright colors, and I'm outside. And now this might be me conflating two things though, but I have just sort of this memory of like being outside and bright colors and, the temperature being like ideal. It wasn't too hot or too cold. Just sort of a happy kid memory of nothing. And later I saw a picture of me outside, and my mom had cosmos flowers planted outside our house. And I don't directly remember cosmos being planted outside my house when I was little, but maybe that was the bright flowers in my memory, right? Because that would have been in the summertime when the weather was good. And so I'm like, maybe these flowers are the thing that I'm remembering in my memory, but I don't know, right? Like that's the bad part, is that you don't really know what that memory is. It's just sort of this shapeless, formless feeling. And I just would like to argue that, while it's true that these big events that emerge during these cued autobiographical memory recall exercises, these really early ones are autobiographical facts, more likely for people, where they just remember that they were in the hospital. Sometimes we have got some pretty emotion-laden, sort of just feelings-based memories that are floating around. So if you have any of those, I know what you're talking about. If you're thinking, well, I have those too. The trick is how to like quantify them so that we could actually talk about them psychologically. Like how would we actually measure them in people? Because I don't know about you guys, but those weird memories that I have like that, I don't know if I can completely retrieve them on purpose. Like, I think it's one of those things that just sort of, it pops into your head. Sometimes I'll smell something. Have you guys ever had this where you smell something and it just gives you sort of this vague sense of familiarity, and you almost can say what it's related to, but you can't quite do it. You're like, this reminds me of something. Oh, I can't do it. I don't know what it is, right? And it's just right there tickling your memory. Smell oftentimes can do that for us. We're going to talk about that more. But it's some of those kinds of aspects of autobiographical memory nobody yet has figured out how to study. Like that's pretty tricky, and we don't really know how to study that yet. All right, well, I went on for a while on that, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick up with the emergence of autobiographical memory in the next segment.